Have you ever wondered why, despite all technological advances, all the freedom of information, and all the supposed individual empowerment we celebrate today, you often feel as if you are following a script you didn't write? Perhaps you've noticed that strange feeling at the end of a workday when you realize you've spent hours reacting to stimuli instead of acting with purpose. Or maybe you've experienced that unsettling moment when, while talking with friends, you notice that all of you are repeating the same phrases, the same opinions, as if they were original, but they actually seem to have been implanted in your minds. This feeling that something is operating behind the scenes of your consciousness is not paranoia. It's an accurate intuition about a disturbing reality of our time. We are living in an era where the reprogramming of humanity is not just a theoretical possibility, but an ongoing project happening on multiple fronts simultaneously. And what's most disturbing is that many of us are participating in this process voluntarily, offering not only our data, but our very capacity for self-determination, often without understanding the deep implications of this surrender. To understand what is happening, we must first recognize that human manipulation is not a new phenomenon. Since the earliest agricultural empires, elites have developed sophisticated methods to direct the behavior of the masses. The Code of Hammurabi was not just a set of laws, but a social technology designed to shape how people thought about justice, property, and their place in the social hierarchy. The elaborate rituals in the pyramids of ancient Egypt were not merely expressions of religious faith, but carefully designed mechanisms to reinforce a worldview that legitimized pharaonic power. And when medieval priests controlled access to knowledge through texts written in Latin, they were not simply preserving information, they were exercising control over which ideas could circulate and how they would be interpreted. What makes our historical moment different is not the existence of manipulation, but the convergence of technologies and methodologies that make this manipulation exponentially more precise, more personalized, more pervasive, and more invisible than anything our ancestors ever faced. We are witnessing the emergence of an infrastructure of influence that not only shapes our external behaviors, but reconfigures our very subjectivity, altering how we experience the world and ourselves. The first epicenter of this reprogramming is what we can call the attention economy. While previous societies struggled with a scarcity of information, we face the opposite problem: an overload of stimuli fiercely competing for the most valuable resource we possess, our conscious attention. The digital platforms we use daily were not primarily designed to serve us, but to capture, retain, and monetize our attention. Every notification, every infinite feed, every algorithmic recommendation is calibrated through extensive testing to maximize the time we spend engaged. And what many people don't realize is that every minute we dedicate to these platforms is not just time spent, it's time during which our mental processes are being subtly directed. The digital architecture we inhabit is constantly teaching us specific patterns of thought. It is training us to value the immediate over the important, to react rather than reflect, to consume rather than contemplate. The real commodity being traded is not just our data or our view time for advertisers, it's the very plasticity of our brains. And we are allowing this commodity to be exploited not for an hour or a day, but continuously, over years, during the most formative developmental periods for many young people. The second epicenter is what we can identify as the industrialization of emotion. Think for a moment about the concept of emotional triggers, which has become so prevalent in digital marketing language. This is not just a casual metaphor, but a literal description of how algorithmic systems are designed to trigger specific emotional responses: anger, outrage, fear, envy, and the desire for belonging are not just emotions that naturally arise in response to significant events. They are systematically cultivated because they generate predictable engagement. The consequence is that we are being conditioned to experience more extreme, more frequent, and more superficial versions of emotions that evolve to guide us through very different circumstances. Our emotional apparatus, which evolved over millennia to guide us in a world of face-to-face interactions within small communities, is being overloaded and recalibrated to serve the interests of systems that profit from our emotional volatility. It is no surprise that we are witnessing epidemics of anxiety, depression, and social polarization. These are not merely individual failures of adaptation, they are systemic consequences of an informational environment that thrives on our emotional deregulation. The third epicenter is the gamification of social existence. Originally developed for video games, mechanisms such as point systems, competitive rankings, intermittent rewards, and artificial senses of progress have been transplanted into virtually every domain of contemporary life. Fitness apps quantify every step and turn exercise into virtual competition. Learning platforms turn knowledge acquisition into a series of achievements to display. Social networks turn human interactions into popularity metrics through likes, shares, and followers. Even romantic relationships are mediated by systems that reduce human complexity to comparable profiles and algorithmic choices. This gamification is not just a superficial layer over existing behaviors, it is a deep reconfiguration of how we experience our own activities and relationships. We are learning to value behaviors not for their intrinsic worth or contextual meaning, but for how they translate into visible metrics within feedback systems designed by others. The risk is not only that we become dependent on external validation, but that we internalize a worldview in which the value of our actions is inseparable from how they are quantified and ranked within these artificial systems. The fourth epicenter is the financialization of identity. Gradually but inexorably, we are being taught to see ourselves as assets whose value can and should be continually optimized. The concept of a personal brand is perhaps the most explicit example of this trend. It is no longer enough to be competent in your work or authentic in your relationships. You must strategically cultivate a public persona that maximizes your market value. This financial logic penetrates more deeply than many realize. Educational choices are increasingly framed as investments in human capital, with the value of knowledge reduced to its potential economic return. Even intimate experiences, like travel, relationships, or personal challenges, are often evaluated by how they can be converted into shareable content that increases social or, in some cases, monetary capital. The fundamental problem with this financialization is not merely that it is reductionist, but that it trains us to see ourselves and others through an instrumental lens that is fundamentally dehumanizing. When we internalize the idea that our primary value is as an asset to be optimized, we lose touch with deeper and more meaningful forms of self-worth and mutual recognition. The fifth epicenter of this reprogramming is what we can call the deterritorialization of epistemic authority. In earlier eras, knowledge was anchored in specific places and mediated by recognizable institutions with their limitations and biases, but also with mechanisms of accountability. The university, the public library, the local newspaper, the family doctor all offered not just information, but contexts for interpreting that information. The contemporary digital environment has decoupled knowledge from its territorial and institutional roots, creating an apparently disintermediated informational space where all bits of information seem to exist on the same plane of authority. This apparent democratization of knowledge hides a more complex reality. We have not eliminated epistemic authority. We have merely transferred it to search algorithms, content ranking mechanisms, and virality dynamics that determine which information receives attention and which is relegated to obscurity. The problem is not that we have too many sources of information, but that we have lost the contexts that once allowed us to assess their reliability and relevance. Instead, we are developing a dependency on algorithmic systems that were not primarily designed to promote truth or understanding, but to maximize engagement. The result is not a true democratization of knowledge, but a reconfiguration of how epistemic authority works, often in ways that are more opaque and less accountable than the imperfect systems they replaced. The sixth epicenter is the deregulation of shared reality. One of the most disturbing features of our era is the progressive weakening of social and institutional structures that historically ensured some degree of consensus about what constitutes reality. I am not referring here to legitimate differences of interpretation or perspective, which have always existed, but to the systematic erosion of the common ground from which those differences could meaningfully be debated. Information technologies that promise to connect the world have also facilitated the fragmentation of the public sphere into hermetically sealed epistemic bubbles, where not only different opinions, but entirely different sets of facts circulate. This fragmentation is not merely a side effect, it is actively encouraged by algorithmic systems that thrive on polarized engagement and by actors who benefit from the erosion of institutional trust. Alongside this, we are witnessing advances in media manipulation technologies that make it increasingly difficult to distinguish the real from the fabricated. Deepfakes, algorithmic image manipulation, and generative language systems are rapidly erasing the traditional markers of authenticity we once relied on to navigate the informational world. The danger here goes beyond the spread of specific falsehoods. It is the potential dissolution of the very idea that there is an objective reality independent of our preferences or political conveniences. When we lose the ability to agree on the basic contours of shared reality, we lose the foundation necessary for any meaningful collective deliberation. The seventh and perhaps deepest epicenter of this reprogramming is what we can call the industrialization of consciousness. For millennia, human conscious experience evolved in response to natural and social environments that, however varied, shared certain fundamental characteristics. Our attention evolved to navigate physical landscapes. Our emotions evolved to mediate face-to-face relationships. Our cognitive processes evolved to identify patterns relevant to our survival and flourishing in natural settings. Now, however, for the first time, our conscious experience is being systematically shaped by environments designed not to serve our evolutionary needs, but to serve specific commercial, political, and technological imperatives. We are not just acquiring new information or adopting new beliefs. We are being trained to experience reality in fundamentally different ways. We are developing new habits of attention, new emotional sensitivities, new cognitive reflexes, new patterns of socialization, all calibrated not to help us live well, but to make us more receptive to certain forms of influence and control. What is at stake is not only what we think or do, but how we experience the act of thinking, how we inhabit our own bodies, how we perceive time, how we conceive our own agency. This is the most ambitious project of human engineering ever attempted, conducted not from a unified command center, but through the convergence of technologies, economic incentives, and social dynamics that together constitute a global machine for transforming human subjectivity. Faced with these 7 epicenters of reprogramming, it's understandable that many feel disoriented, powerless, or resigned. But it would be a mistake to conclude that we are condemned to be passive in this process. The very act of understanding these mechanisms is itself a form of resistance, because what remains invisible holds far greater power over us than what we can name and critically examine. It would also be a mistake to imagine that we can simply disconnect or return to a previous state of existence. The integration of digital technology into our individual and collective lives is irreversible, and any meaningful response must begin with this reality, not with nostalgic fantasies of an idealized pre-digital past. The challenge we face is not to reject technology, but to develop a more conscious, deliberate, and sovereign relationship with it. This requires active cultivation of capacities that current digital environments tend to atrophy: sustained attention, independent critical thinking, epistemic discernment, emotional self-awareness, and the ability to experience human connection that is not mediated by commercial platforms. It also requires a more collective approach. Individuals can make choices to protect their own cognitive autonomy, but the structures we've described operate on a systemic scale and can only be effectively addressed through equally systemic responses. This means developing not only new individual practices, but new social norms, new institutional structures, new regulatory frameworks, and perhaps most fundamentally, new shared visions of what constitutes genuine technological progress. However, even as we work on these collective responses, each of us faces daily choices that can strengthen or weaken our capacity for cognitive self-determination. Every time we consciously decide where to direct our attention, every time we resist the impulse to react emotionally to algorithmic provocations, every time we seek information that challenges our assumptions instead of merely confirming them, every time we cultivate human connections based on mutual recognition rather than social performance, we are exercising and strengthening essential capacities for maintaining our humanity in an age of systematic manipulation. This is not an easy path. The technologies and systems we have described are designed precisely to bypass our rational defenses, exploit our psychological vulnerabilities, and guide us down predetermined paths of least resistance. Maintaining self-determination in such an environment requires constant vigilance, which is itself exhausting. But the alternative, passive surrender to these systems of influence carries far greater costs, not only to our individual well-being, but also to our collective capacity to confront the existential challenges our species faces. The central irony of our era is that while we develop increasingly sophisticated technologies to manipulate human consciousness, we also face global crises, from climate change to systemic inequality, that require precisely the kind of conscious, reflective, and collective human agency that these systems of manipulation tend to undermine. The question is not only whether we can resist manipulation, but whether we can cultivate forms of consciousness capable of recognizing and responding to the true challenges of our time instead of being continuously distracted, polarized, and fragmented. The future is not written. The systems of manipulation we've described are powerful, but they are not omnipotent. They possess inherent vulnerabilities, internal contradictions, and ultimately depend on our continued participation, even when that participation is often obtained through manipulative means. The growing awareness of these systems is itself a source of hope. More people are beginning to recognize how their minds are being shaped by external forces, and this recognition is the first necessary step toward developing effective responses. Human history is full of moments when technologies of social control seemed irresistible, only to be eventually overcome by new forms of consciousness and social organization. The rigid hierarchies of agricultural empires, the unquestionable dogmas of medieval theocracies, the totalitarian ideologies of the 20th century all seemed, in their moments of dominance, to have achieved definitive control over human consciousness. Yet, all eventually encountered their limits in the inexhaustible human capacity for awareness, resistance, and renewal. There is no reason to believe that the systems of manipulation of our own time will be exceptions to this historical pattern. The true danger is not that we will be completely controlled by these technologies of influence, but that in the absence of a clear understanding of how they work and how to resist them, we will fail to develop our full human potential during this critical period in history. The real cost of manipulation is not merely what it makes us do, but what it prevents us from becoming. Now, I want to pause for a moment to ask you directly, which of these 7 epicenters of manipulation do you feel has the greatest impact on your own life? In which moments do you most clearly perceive that your choices, your thoughts, your emotions may be subtly guided by systems designed to influence you? This is not a rhetorical question, but a genuine invitation to reflection. Many of us experience these effects daily without naming them explicitly, and there is real power in bringing this awareness to the surface. If this topic resonates with you, share your experience in the comments. It can be as simple as writing, "The epicenter that affects me the most is because." Your reflection not only deepens your own understanding, but may illuminate aspects of this phenomenon that others have not yet perceived. Remember that recognizing these influences is the first step in regaining some measure of autonomy over them. Returning to our exploration, It is important to recognize that the 7 epicenters of manipulation I've identified are not isolated phenomena, but interconnected parts of a broader ecosystem of influence. The attention economy fuels the industrialization of emotion, which in turn facilitates the gamification of social existence, which reinforces the financialization of identity, and so on. Together, they form a persuasion infrastructure that is more powerful than any of its individual parts. This interconnected system is not the result of a centralized conspiracy, but emerges from the convergence of economic incentives, technological capabilities, and social dynamics that together create an environment where manipulation not only thrives, but becomes the default operational norm. Corporations that would otherwise compete with one another implicitly collaborate in building this infrastructure because all benefit from the increasing malleability of human behavior. Technological platforms that claim to be neutral adopt design mechanics that systematically favor certain types of behavior and modes of thought. Even individuals who recognize and criticize these dynamics often find themselves collaborating with them, whether out of professional necessity, social pressure, or simply the convenience these platforms provide. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this system is how it reproduces and strengthens itself through our own behavior. The more time we spend in digital environments designed to maximize engagement, the more our brains adapt to these environments, developing patterns of attention, reward expectations, and emotional reflexes that make us even more susceptible to future manipulation. The very tools we use to try to understand this system are often embedded within it, creating a kind of recursive loop from which it is extraordinarily difficult to escape. Even this video you are watching now exists within this ecosystem, subject to recommendation algorithms, engagement metrics, and economic incentives that shape how information is presented and received. Recognizing this reality is not surrendering to despair, but accepting the complexity of the challenge we face. There is no single or simple solution for reclaiming our cognitive autonomy in an environment so pervasively designed to compromise it. Instead, we need to develop a diverse repertoire of strategies tailored to different aspects of the problem. At an individual level, we can start by cultivating greater awareness of how we interact with digital technologies. This means observing not only the content we consume, but the patterns of our own engagement. How much time do we spend scrolling aimlessly? How often do we check notifications reflexively? How are our moods and thoughts affected after spending time on different platforms? This self-observation is not about judgment or guilt, but about developing a clearer understanding of how these technologies are shaping our experience. We can also adopt deliberate practices to strengthen capacities that counterbalance the tendencies these systems promote. Meditation and other contemplative practices can cultivate sustained attention in a world designed to fragment it. Deep reading of physical books can exercise cognitive muscles that tend to atrophy under constant consumption of short-form digital content. Regular face-to-face encounters without technological mediation can remind us what human connection feels like when it is not being continuously quantified and performed for a virtual audience. On a social and political level, we need a much more robust debate about how digital technologies are shaping not only individual behaviors, but also social norms, democratic processes, and economic structures. This requires moving beyond superficial discussions about screen time or isolated cases of misinformation to examine how the very architecture of these systems is reconfiguring how we experience reality and relate to one another. We also need new regulatory and institutional frameworks that recognize that technologies shaping human cognition are not neutral, but embody specific values, priorities, and worldviews. Just as we have developed protections for physical safety and basic rights, we must develop safeguards for the integrity of our collective cognitive ecology. More fundamentally, we need new narratives about what constitutes genuine technological progress. The current dominant narrative frames technological success almost exclusively in terms of efficiency, convenience, profitability, and growth. We need narratives that value technologies that genuinely enhance human autonomy, strengthen cognitive capacities, facilitate meaningful connections, and support our ability to face complex collective challenges. The task of developing these new narratives, practices, and frameworks is immense and goes far beyond what any individual or organization can accomplish. But each of us can contribute to this collective project through our own choices, conversations, and actions. Every time we consciously choose how to engage with technology, every time we start conversations about these issues with friends and family, every time we support initiatives and policies that promote a healthier relationship with technology, we are helping shape how our society will respond to this historic challenge. The path ahead is neither clear nor straightforward, and there will inevitably be setbacks and difficulties. But human history is a story of continuous adaptation, of facing new challenges with new capacities. The systems of manipulation I've described are powerful, but human creativity, resilience, and wisdom are equally powerful. Within our nature lies not only the vulnerability to influence, but also the ability to recognize that influence and develop new forms of autonomy in response. If these reflections resonated with your own experiences and concerns about the world we are building together, I invite you to join us in this ongoing exploration. By subscribing to this channel, you'll connect with a community of people equally committed to understanding and navigating the profound challenges of our era. Each week, we meet here to examine the forces shaping our present and future, not just to understand them intellectually, but to cultivate wiser ways of living amid them. I don't offer simple answers or guaranteed formulas, but a space for honest contemplation and meaningful dialogue about the questions that matter most. If you seek not just information, but understanding, not just optimization, but wisdom, subscribe so we can continue this journey together. In a world where our attention is constantly fragmented and commodified, creating spaces for sustained reflection and genuine connection is not only an act of self-preservation, but also a form of resistance and renewal. In closing, I want to return to the question we began with. That unsettling feeling that you're following a script you didn't write, that something is operating behind the scenes of your consciousness, is not an illusion or paranoia. It's an accurate perception of a disturbing reality of our age. We are indeed being subtly reprogrammed through these 7 epicenters of manipulation in ways that profoundly affect how we experience reality and ourselves. But recognizing that manipulation is already an act of resistance, a step toward reclaiming our capacity for self-determination. And though the challenge is immense, our capacity for adaptation, understanding, and transformation is equally powerful. The future is not fixed. It will be shaped by the choices we make now, both individually and collectively, about how we relate to the technologies that are transforming what it means to be human. Every moment of awareness, every deliberate act of choice, every genuine connection we make is an affirmation of our humanity in a world that often seems designed to diminish it. And within these small acts of cognitive sovereignty and human connection may lie the seeds of a future where technology truly serves human flourishing rather than subordinating it to other ends. It's just our fortune and misfortune as a species that we think in stories. So if you want to make a point, you have to take the messiness of reality and cast it as a story, otherwise people don't understand. And we have now all these discussions about, for example, climate change. How to make the general public understand what is happening, what is the enormity of the crisis we are facing, what is the evidence supporting it, what should we do? The problem is scientists, including climate scientists, they think in facts, in numbers, in statistics, in equations, in graphs, all the things that make most people fall asleep or just not get it. If you really want to make the public understand climate change, you need a story.
I go to therapy every week. I have a weekly session. People can wonder, why do people need to go to therapy? The subject matter in therapy is myself. Who knows myself better than me? Why do I need to go to some stranger to learn about myself? This is ridiculous. But it's not. Because yes, I know more about myself than any other person perhaps, but there are so many things I don't want to know about myself. I have access to all the data, to the memories, to the daily events, but I reject some things I really like to know about myself, but the more painful, the darker episodes in my life, the more painful things I do in the present, it's very difficult for a person to acknowledge that about oneself. If you're in a relationship and there is a problem in a relationship, you ask and people would say, I'm perfect. It's the other person who is causing all the problem. If only the other person changed a little, behaved differently, everything would be perfect. And you ask the other person, they would say exactly the same thing. I'm perfect. It's my husband, it's my wife that is causing all the problem in our household. So this is why you need to go to therapy, to get professional help, to realize some very deep truths about yourself that are too difficult or too painful to acknowledge. History is like therapy for entire civilizations or for the whole of humankind. Also, entire nations often don't want to acknowledge dark episodes in their past or dark things they are doing right now. Entire civilizations, the same. You ask, and almost every nation, almost every country would say, we are perfect. All the problems are because of the other nations. All the problems are because of the other civilizations, of the other cultures. I think the responsible job of historians to simply help people understand better the big processes and the deep sources of the problems in the world, and this is a big responsibility.
Every year, more than 1 million people die all over the world in car accidents. Most of them are caused by human error, like people drinking and then driving or falling asleep at the wheel or whatever. Self-driving vehicles are likely to save about 1 million lives every year. This is amazing. You think about climate change. So yes, developing the AIs will consume a lot of energy, but they could also find new sources of energy, new ways to harness energy that could be our best shot at preventing ecological collapse. So there is enormous positive potential. We shouldn't deny that. We should be aware of it. And on the other hand, it's very difficult to appreciate the dangers because the dangers, again, they are kind of alien.